in support of your local independent bookstore. My name is Johanna Rupp, your host, and this evening Book Passage is very proud to welcome Jacob Rubin, screenwriter and author. His former jobs, however, as stand-up comic, magician, and lead singer of a popular hip-hop band, created the fertile ground for his debut novel. Entitled The Poser, this is an original and highly entertaining book chronicling the amazing adventures of one man's rise to fame from small-town obscurity. Michael Upchurch of the Washington Post writes, "The Poser seduces you with its fanciful prose, its larger-than-life characters, and its funhouse mirror take on a land of opportunity where appearance often trumps reality. It's also one heck of a way for Rubin to announce his own presence on the literary stage." And so with that, I'd love to have you help me welcome Jacob Rubin.
I may borrow this copy to read from. Is that okay? Yeah, just thank you for coming, everyone. Adrian, you're probably going to hear me read the same thing I read last night. Yeah. So I have to tell you that in the car. Thanks very much for having me. It's been fun to get to poke my head in various independent bookstores around California and the country. This is it's a book about an impressionist, someone who's born with the compulsion and the ability to basically imitate anyone he meets. And he's just given a performance, and a reporter has asked him to describe this concept of a thread, and he's going to explain it. So, the thread, I said. Downstairs they'd started stacking chairs and clearing the stage. Shadowy figures scooped up at tables, glasses, four in a hand, and pushed back first through the doors. Well, okay, so most people believe imitation to be an art of exaggeration. There's truth to this, of course. It's important as a tool it is, but it comes second. Bernard, I noticed only then, sat at the end of the bar. It might have been a photo of him if not for the smoke rising from his cigarette. Now, I was fortunate to be born with the elastic limbs, the perfect pitch you and your colleagues have been kind enough to write about. But I would have been lost without this knowledge. The real thing, the heart of it, isn't exaggeration or even duplication. It's selection, knowing which parts of a person to take and which to leave alone. I frowned the way people do to indicate a concept too complex to be articulated. You see, everyone disguises himself with certain gestures. A man clearing his throat while snapping open a newspaper, the way a woman covers her yawn on the bus. These gestures are a costume. Now, some do it better than others. Some have made perfect little suits for themselves, politicians, for instance, movie stars, those charismatic types who tool around in their bodies like rented sports cars. They're smooth, right? Vandaline's reporter held the notepad at his chest like a cop writing a ticket. The miracle of the world, Mr. Vandeline, is that no one's disguise is perfect. There is in every person, no matter how graceful, a seam, a thread curling out of them. It's like a pimple rouge can't cover up, a patch of thinning hair. Often it's the almost unnoticed thing that's a thread, a bit lip, a slight sigh, but when pulled by the right hands, it will unravel the person entire. In the silence that I knew would follow, I found myself thinking of Mama, how she and Mr. Derringer looked that day in the glass of the principal's door, a patch of red, Mama, a blob of black, Derringer. It was a sort of magic what the closed door did to them, or seemed like it from the outer office where I was made to wait. Across from me, the principal's secretary, Mrs. Chapabel, mouthed words she clacked on a typewriter out of view. Every few minutes she'd look up at the desk's basket of candy canes. "You don't want a tasty treat?" she asked. The smile I was holding began to wilt. Suit yourself, but if you change your mind, you know exactly where they are. She winked and had lowered her gaze to the typewriter, thank God, when I burped up, suit yourself. What was that, she said. The phone on her desk rang. Principal Derringer's office. Oh, hi, Susan. Yes, but no, he's in it. You want me to? Perfect. 5 o'clock at the... Okay, great. There was a giggling by the door where 2 girls stood. They grinned like hobos, mouths pocked with missing teeth. Freak, they whispered, monkey. I was standing up when the principal's door yawned open and out strode Mama. There must have been an event at the library, for she wore her fanciest dress, the checkered one with the belted waist and big bow at the collar. It didn't matter what she wore. Mama was the queen of every room. She thanked Mrs. Chapabel, took my hand, and walked me out of the office. Outside it was overcast, and the wind sprayed a hint of salt on the school building, Main Street, and the animal-faced cars as if to prevent it all from going bad. When we reached the curb, Mama looked down at me with an exaggerated frown. It did no harm. Beatrice Bernini was a beautiful woman, I'd heard other people say. That Derringer's a real crow, isn't he? Someone ought to tell him life's already started, she said. With that, she snatched my hand and just short of skipped me across Main Street, past Lipswich Avenue to the gusty boardwalk, where she plopped down on a bench and promptly folded her legs. She patted the space next to where she sat, and I joined her. Before us stretched the ocean, its gulls and clouds. Ah, school's all screwed up, she said. How to laugh, what jokes are. Those should be the first things they teach you. Come. I sat stiff as a post until she ducked behind me and lit a cigarette. Mr. Headling, huh? Headling. Whatever interests had led him to the profession of teacher, a desire on his part to spend his weeks in the company of 13-year-old boys and girls could not have been counted among them. The paraded sense of humor, the jaunty manner some teachers perfect so as to endear themselves to adolescent tastes, Headling never attempted. He spoke to us like a drunk at a bar, often gruff, rarely dishonest. Word was he had been discharged from the army after falling victim to or helping perpetrate a massacre on a distant palm tree island. His method of instruction was one of impassioned repetition. The previous week he had repeated, "Don't you envy Sisyphus?" We were forced to scribble it in our notebooks 30 times. What did Helen of Troy look like, he asked that day. As he lectured, he stalked and circled our desk chairs, curling Mary Hammerworth's anthology of Greek myth around its spine. Since he could fly into a rage if he suspected the slightest bit of daydreaming or note-passing, the class did its best to strike postures of earnest attention. For my classmates, I guess this involved some theater, not for me. I love the Greeks. They weren't like other stories where you, the reader, decide if they're any good. Questioning Atlas's or Icarus's fate was like complaining the ocean rolled the wrong way, or the sky carried the weather with too much pomp. Inspired by those stories, I've been on good behavior all semester. Each fall was that way, offering a brief window of renewal. In recess, I watched the older boys play stickball. The way they strode and wound up to fling the ball, all of it such glamorous evidence of what growing up could do. And every night I went to bed hoping the big change would happen, that I would stretch to 6 feet tall and say goodbye to all that trouble at school. In fact, things had been looking up. I'd even volunteered in class, a once unthinkable risk made possible by a new strategy. That is, I'd begun using the voice of Jimmy Nelson, the bemused and even witty son of Danny Hoagland's neighbor on the popular radio program The Hoaglands. It seemed a safe choice. For one, Jimmy Nelson appeared on the show irregularly, and when he did, existed mainly to air concern in the face of Rascal Hoagland's latest lawn-ruining mischief. His very off-to-the-sidedness appealed to me. "Tell me now, what did Helen of Troy look like?" Headling asked. "My mother," Philip Howes volunteered. Philip sat in the front row and was always offering a first response to Headling's questions, even though our teacher had never approved of his answers and once in a fit of anger called him a quote-unquote true egg sucker. "You're wrong," Headling said. He asked Alice Crutt, who sat behind Philip, "What did Helen of Troy look like?" "Rebecca Rell, the cheerleader," she said. "Absolutely incorrect." He asked Adrian Chitwood, who sat behind Alice, "What did she look like?" "A movie star." "Oh God," he said. He addressed the classroom. "What did she look like?" Silence. Jesus Christ. He turned to draw on the board. Because Mr. Headling possessed exquisite peripheral vision, no one misbehaved even when he faced the blackboard. He often called on Todd Willinger, third seat, row 5, while looking at Mallory Mayhall, first seat, row 1. Someone asked him why he did this, and he gave that person detention. With staccato strokes, he drew a stick-figure face, 2 tiny circles for eyes, a line for a nose, a line for a mouth. Then he drew curly sprouts of hair. Helen of Troy, he said. As with many of Headling's lessons, it was hard to tell what the lesson was, but a fury of passion was behind it, so you knew you were missing something. When he taught us the myth of Orpheus, he kept saying, music is when something disappears, hovering over us as we scribbled the saying 10 times in our notebooks. Helen of Troy, Headling said again, looking almost pleased. That's just a face, Philip Howes protested. Headling stopped and looked at him. Philip, he said, be very careful. He marched behind us to the other side of the classroom. Helen of Troy, he said, the one and only. He was wrong, though. Helen of Troy inhabited our very classroom, 3 rows to my right through a thicket of profiles. Her name was Margot Stamfield, and she was the chandelier in my brain. Every class I studied her face, the subtle lift of her chin, the hint of a smile. Once when I was heading down the 4th floor stairs repeating, don't you envy Sisyphus, Headling's phrases were like sucking candy to me. I rounded the landing to find her standing there in all her Martian beauty, clutching a textbook. Envy him, goddammit, I yelped and sprinted down the stairs. Copy this in your notebooks, Headling said, stalking the class. A flurry of turned pages, the mouse noise of pencils. This is a very important face, remember, he said, essential. Without it, what's this, Miss Stanfield? It's what you wanted, Margot said. Headling hovered over her desk chair, I saw when I looked up. To draw it 10 times, she said. Is it, he said, is that what I wanted, really? With a light-footed movement, Headling all but danced to the front of the class, where he drew with quick, impassioned stabs of chalk a second Helen of Troy. The chalk dusted his hands, a very specific feeling. This new figure, Margot's presumably, looked admirably close, if not identical to the first. The same, really, he asked. They are, right, she said. Are they, though? Headling grinned, approaching her desk again. He could move stealthily, too, with quick, cat-like steps I like to practice. I think so, she said. Perhaps you're thinking too much, Miss Stanfield. Her lips began to quiver. Miss Stanfield, no need to get emotional. I'm simply asking. I found I was pacing along the side of the classroom. I grabbed a piece of chalk to feel it on my hand. I'm asking, I repeated, if you can answer me that, please. Write the answer 10 times, please. I'm asking if you can write, erase, no, 11, yeah, erase it, yes. Mr. Headling reddened in the corner of my eye, but my classmates laughed uncontrollably, laughed in that bottled way as if soda were bursting out of their noses, Margot among them. And I turned to them and began laughing too. Yes, this laugh was so delicious, it burst out of me, more and more of it, until their faces blanched, Margot's most of all, as though some mean ghost were parading before them. Yet the laughter kept cascading out of my nose, so much of it like the handkerchief a magician endlessly pulls out of his pocket. Someone grabbed the back of my neck. Get out, I did it for Mama at the boardwalk. You little why hello, Principal Derringer's office. Yes, of course, Helen of Troy, I said, of Troy. When I looked back at her, Mama was beyond laughter, already casting her look at me, her capital L look, I should say, for Mama's eyes were unnaturally big and could do things no one else's could. It was all the parts of her you couldn't reach, that interior mystery pushed against their furthest limit, and you gathered how much she hated the rules of bodies, that one person could be only one, and that certain spaces would always separate us. Most rooms just weren't big enough for her. You found his thread, she said, and you want to pull it, don't you? Undo his whole costume. She reached out her hands for me, and I sat in her lap. She growled and squeezed me, crushed me for a moment in the near violent way mothers do. The sky was getting grayer. Soon winter would come when darkness falls at 4 o'clock, and the stars make sad, dreaming babies of all the world. One day everyone will see you the way I do, she said. She said this often. People don't like me. Not true, she said. I have no friends. Friends are overrated. You'll get some soon enough and see what I mean. Giovanni Vandeline, the reporter said. Yes. I said, if everyone has this thread, as you call it, this seam sticking out, well then I must ask, what's yours? The men leaned in. At the far end of the bar, Bernard raised his cigarette to his lips. Why, I said, I'm the exception. Thank you. That concludes the reading. I'm happy to answer any questions, if anybody has any. Yes, Ashley?
So I'm curious how much of your own, this is probably something people ask you a lot, but how much of your own experience went into this, and were you conscious of trying to camouflage that in any way, or did you kind of pull things verbatim from your life?
That's a good question. I mean, it's definitely not on its face an autobiographical book, because it's set in this sort of phantasmagoric America with, or a sort of bizarro America with this uniquely talented person whose talent I don't share, but I do think there's probably a lot of my own internal life injected into his experience one way or another, but it hasn't, whether I've included or excluded that wasn't, I tried as much as possible to make that not a conscious decision one way or another, but just to try to tell the story and then save my embarrassment for moments like this. So no, I'm kidding. So I just tried to sort of recuse myself as much as I could. But there's I read an interview with Philip Roth where he's talking about how people get into writing in order to basically flee all of their earthly concerns, you know, to as an act of flight from like home and themselves. But then ironically, they end up writing about all the things they tried to flee. So I definitely think that's true. It's felt true for me.
So may I ask you a question? So how do you keep
Yes.
this reality light and not so sarcastic and ironic as families are after you here and there?
Wait, I'm sorry. As ironic as what?
How do you keep your sense for caricature light and wonderful and fun and inspiring when families are after me with punishment and irony and sarcasm and jealousy, when I learned a long time ago to be happy about that I got out to live this lifestyle I wanted.
Well, I sent them after you so they wouldn't bother me. So that's how. No, so that's my excuse. You just have to find someone else to send them after. You have to. I think if I understand your question correctly, I think one of the sort of alchemical, transformative qualities of humor is that things that are the most upsetting, the most depressing, and that make you feel the most impotent, you know, and out of control are actually sources of great humor. So I think that's the gift. I know for me, when I'm feeling very despairing, I laugh a lot. It helps me to feel better about, it's sort of maybe illusory, but it's a sense of having a way to wrap your consciousness around a circumstance you may not be able to overcome bodily, you know, but you can sort of expand and using a cosmic sense of humor, control. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
or?
I've been doing this, except every time I come back home to Marin County from my travels where I'm practicing a lot of that, people get even more angry at me.
Well, don't come home.
That's why
Move.
my friends have been elders, and most of them have died now these last 10 years. You know?
Yeah.
I'm so curious to magnetize this energy from creating these breakthroughs and these transformations.
Well, thank you. Oh, yeah.
So this is your debut novel. How long did it take you to write, and where did you find the time?
Yeah.
Your other.
Well, I started writing it in the Cretaceous period, right after it's been a while. So I've seen a lot of changes on Earth. No, the inception of the book, sort of the first seed of it occurred to me a while ago, about 10 years ago. And I've worked on other things in between and done other things. I've worked mainly, well, I was in graduate school. I went to grad school, got an MFA, so that's where I sort of first had the sustained time and some support financially, because I was given a stipend and was teaching, so that helped me. And then I was working as a temp for a little while, and then I've worked for a while as an SAT tutor, which I live in New York, and it's sort of provided me with some support financially and enough flexibility scheduling wise that for me, I found when I had a 9 to 5, it was sort of bludgeoning, and it was hard to leave it with much sense of imagination or play. So I think I prefer work where you're sort of engaged, and maybe it's, 2 hours of teaching are certainly more intense than 2 hours of sitting at a cubicle, but you're sort of engaged and you're active, hopefully, and then you're free of it, rather than sort of just being in a dulled state in front of a computer for 8 hours. I didn't find conducive to creative work. So, but so it's helped me to have that job. And now I'm, now that I have $1 million, I can say goodbye to that. Yeah.
There's also a lot in the character's name. Is there anything behind Giovanni that you want to share?
Yeah, well, so he's, the name.
Other than reminding me of like Houdini.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
reference.
Well, and it's so in the book, it's he's been given his father's name, and his father's absent, and so I sort of like the idea of him inheriting, and his father's Italian, and immigration sort of becomes a theme, and I like the idea of inheriting sort of a signifier whose contents you don't quite know, so he doesn't know the man whose name he bears, sort of. It's sort of also a shout out to an Italian sculptor, and he's sort of a sculptor, and I sort of tried to make Europe and other countries more clearly denoted and solid. They have a solidity that the America of the book doesn't quite have, so I sort of wanted him to feel loosely tied to this culture that he can't really access. So.
Any more questions? Good.
You can ask about anything. It doesn't have to be about the book or me.
Do you have another book?
I'm working slowly on another book, yeah. But yeah, it's sort of very amorphous now, but I'm hoping it'll come together.
Because the crustacean period?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I have
Yeah.
another question.
Yeah.
Did you find at the end of writing this that it was hard to sort of put the characters away, or do they still live with you? I mean, as you...
Yeah, it's a good, it was sort of a weird combination. My teacher, Barry Hanna, who Ashley knew, Ashley and I met in Oxford, so he used to say that no work's ever finished, it's just abandoned, and you sort of just have to almost arbitrarily pick when you're gonna leave it be. And I definitely think there's some truth to that. It was sort of an odd experience when it was finally finished. The experience of writing a book for me was very similar to like a dream state, in that when you're in it, it's totally immersive. And then you sort of wake up, and maybe you think about it a little bit during breakfast, and maybe it stays with you a little bit, but then it's sort of gone. So it's a weird, I don't know, it's sort of totally engaging. It's on your mind all the time, and then it's like finished, and it's like poof. So, yeah, I don't know, it's a weird sort of way to, maybe it's a defense or something.
Like you're kind of like just a vessel, and it just is coming through you, just writing?
Well, when it's going well, it feels like that. Other times, you feel,
Writer's block.
yeah. Well, you feel, and I've also heard writer's block described as it being, rather than necessarily being a block or an obstruction, it's more just being sort of empty. Like your well is sort of run dry for the moment and there's nothing to draw from. So
So don't force it into
I think that's right, yeah. Go to a museum or something, or go for a walk, or read or do something to sort of refill, your water supply or whatever.
I'm reading a lot of D.H. Lawrence right now, and he talks about that, and how when he was writing, he sat there and went to a pond or went to a beautiful spot, and it just, hours and hours have gone by, and he doesn't know where they went. I mean, it just is so flowing and going so fast.
Mm.
He
Yeah.
just had to handwrite, it was 100 years ago, it was just handwriting.
Well, there's
Your hand must be your arm.
Yeah, their hands were much stronger than ours. Yeah. Well, there's a David Lynch quote I like too, where in a book of his, he says that, he was talking about painters, but I think it holds for all kinds of artists and creative people. That he was saying for a painter to get 1 good hour of painting in, you actually need 5 hours, to just sort of be, and to take a walk and to sit by a pond or whatever it might be. And all of that is actually contributing to that 1 hour when you're literally producing. And it can be very dangerous. I think about this with like arts education, when it's like you take away, I'm just going to get very political right now, but if you take away, access to dance and music and stuff like that, people don't realize how much that helps and complements the learning of science, and how, it sort of lubricates the brain. It's all part of the same process. So the idea that we're just going to sit in one place for like 8 hours a day and just take in all this information, I don't think that's how the brain works. I think you need to sit by a pond. You need to sort of walk around or exercise and stimulate yourself. And so all that, in other words,
If you're in a busy city, I mean, how does that work? I guess it works for you if you're from a big city compared to, the woods.
well, yeah, it's hard. I mean, you've got to find your pond, So there's a little puddle right near my apartment that I go to, and I can sort of see my reflection in it. No, I go to a library, and I write there, so that helps me, I think, tune out some of the distractions of the city. So I think you have to find, but it's certainly different and harder. I live in New York, so it's a different environment. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of environment, I don't know if you're independent or what, could be
Yeah.
very stimulating.
It can be. I think it can be. It's very stimulating. It's sometimes hard to make good on all that stimulation because it's, the sort of Wordsworthian model of having this ecstatic moment and then quiet moments later to sort of reflect upon them is hard to do in New York. You have the ecstatic sort of stimulation, but then you have to try to find the calm but it definitely can be, and you see all kinds of people and can draw from them. So, thank you. Okay, thanks very much.